Hey, y'all. As a growing family, my husband and I love game night, especially when it's Wayfair edition.
Let's do it. You gotta name as many Wayfair furniture and decor categories as you can. Ready? Go.
Sofas, bar stools, beds, ottomans, outdoor seating, bookshelves, kitchen tables, garden sheds, mid-century modern lamps.
Time. Nice. You got 9 out of a lot. Not too bad. Keep practicing by visiting wayfair.com, where you can shop every style for every home.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
This is episode 406 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Dr. Matt Lodder, tattoo historian from the University of Essex in the UK. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
From delectable marchpane in Romeo and Juliet and the herbs of the Merchant of Venice to stewed prunes of Henry IV and carving capons in Love's Labour's Lost, there's a wide gambit of meals consumed in Shakespeare's plays that span from bawdy feasts all the way to elite noble banquets, and even popular meals eaten as much to control your humors as they were for nourishment. The details about food found throughout Shakespeare's plays reflect the real foods that were enjoyed during Shakespeare's lifetime. This week, we are diving into these delectable delights with food historian and author Sam Bilton. She's here to talk about her latest book, Much Ado About Cooking, which was created in collaboration with Shakespeare's Globe and allows us to get a literal taste of Shakespeare. Much Ado About Cooking takes Shakespeare's own food references and pairs them with real recipes from his lifetime, then reimagines those recipes for the modern cook so you can easily make and eat food from the life of William Shakespeare. Together, we'll explore what was on the table at the Boar's Head Inn, why butter became a luxury, and how a plate of overcooked mutton might have been seen as a clever way to smooth out a bad temper. Hello, Sam. Welcome back to That Shakespeare Life. It's really nice to have you visit with us again, and I'm very excited to hear about your new book because it combines two of my favorite things, Shakespeare and food. Yes, please. I can't wait to dive in.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Cassidy. It's a pleasure to be back.
In the play Hamlet, the title character, complains about his mother's hasty remarriage by saying that the baked meats, which would have been served at a funeral, had been repurposed as cold cuts at the marriage feast. Hamlet's personal angst aside here, Sam, tell us about the kinds of meats that would have been served at a funeral for Shakespeare's lifetime.
Well, there's been a long tradition of serving food and putting on sort of not entertainment. That makes it sound like they're having a great big party, and it wasn't like that necessarily at all. But certainly serving food as a way to commemorate the passing of someone important or someone that was well loved or well liked in the community. So that was the de rigueur in the early modern period. But what that feast consisted of really very much depended on your wealth. And if you were very wealthy, like Hamlet is obviously a prince, so we're assuming he's very well-to-do. He's living in a palace. People of his class would have had the disposable income to lay on quite an elaborate feast. So they would have been able to have things like the pies he talks about, the baked meat. A baked meat is a pie, essentially. So something like a venison pasty, which is quite large, or would have been quite large in those days. There would have been joints of meat as well, like beef and mutton, for example. But another funerary tradition from this period, or going back to this period, and possibly even earlier actually, was to give out doles of bread to the poor. So when someone died, quite often, if they had quite a standing in the community, so not necessarily a prince, but even if they were like Lord of the Manor, for example, or some local dignitary, they would leave a bequest in their will often for a dole of bread, a gift of bread to be given to the poor people of their parish. And this also sort of translated later or into biscuits or cakes. So in Twelfth Night, you get this quote from Toby Belch about just because you are virtuous, shall there be no more cakes and ale? Because although he's not referring to funerals per se, the Puritans frowned upon this practice. So when the Reformation occurred in the 1540s, which is slightly before Shakespeare's time, obviously.
I'm sorry, the Puritans frowned upon bread being given to the poor?
Well, it's a tricky one. I think they frowned upon funeral feasts in general. They weren't very fun. I'm talking about the really sort of extreme Puritans
the
at this point.
ultra
Puritans. Yes. So they frowned upon a lot of things. I mean, we could do in a whole different podcast.
Of course, yeah.
But when the phrase that line that Toby Belch says to Malvolio, who it is basically sort of echoing this sentiment that they, things like funeral feasts and giving out. I mean, it does seem extreme to prohibit the giving of doles out, certainly of bread, but cakes and ale were a thing to be served at funerals. So you can imagine that whilst Toby Belch isn't talking about a funeral per se, you get the gist that in Shakespeare's day, perhaps it wasn't maybe as common as, or in certain households, as common as it perhaps had been in the past.
Food shows up liberally at one of Shakespeare's most famous taverns, the Boar's Head Inn, where bawdy suppers are the norm. Today, I think of the quintessential English pub food as being fish and chips with, we call them mushy peas. I think they have a technical term, but they come on the side, and we've seen that. But would these have been the pub foods that Prince Hal and Falstaff were enjoying, or would they have had something else?
Well, they definitely wouldn't have had the chips because potatoes were quite a rarity and quite a novel ingredient in those days. And they actually had a reputation for being an aphrodisiac. So there is a line in The Merry Wives of Windsor, "Let the sky rain potatoes," which is a reference to them being an aphrodisiac. So they wouldn't have had the chips for sure. They may have had fried fish, but I think generally speaking, when we're talking about Falstaff particularly, he was more concerned about drinking a great deal of sack. But we do get an inkling of the sort of things that might have been served in a tavern, because there is an itemised bill that's read out in one, I think it's Henry IV, Part 1, and he has capon, sauce, anchovies, bread, but 2 gallons worth of sack. And this leaves Prince Hal to say, but 1 penny worth of bread to this intolerable amount of sack. So Falstaff was far more concerned about filling his belly with booze rather than filling it with bread or other meats or viands that were available. So you could get, it's feasible they were having mutton, for example. This was a very popular meat of the day. But what we have to be mindful of in Shakespeare's plays is quite often when food is mentioned in the plays, it's not a literal reference. It is sometimes, like the one I just mentioned, the cakes and ale, but it sometimes it's there as a metaphor. So
like the potatoes. Yes.
Like the potatoes. So mutton in particular, references to mutton occur when they're referring to brothels, for example. And there is a line, so I can't remember, it's the hostess, I think, in Henry IV, Part 2 says, "What's a joint of mutton or two in a whole Lent?" Which essentially is meaning that you can, it's fine to have a dalliance with a prostitute, even when you shouldn't do, really. It doesn't matter if it's only once or twice. So, you can't necessarily say just because mutton's mentioned that they were serving mutton, although in this case, I think they probably were serving mutton.
Now, food wasn't always just for meals and frivolity. As we see in Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew, sometimes food was used to try and impact somebody's mood or personality. The character Petruchio seeks to correct the fiery Kate by denying her choleric foods, such as overcooked mutton. Sam, do you prepare any recipes in your book that reflect this idea of settling a fiery temper, or would this be considered Renaissance comfort foods? Is kind of where my brain went in terms of calming effect of food.
Well, we have a very different interpretation of comfort foods in this day and age. I think in Shakespeare's day, what they were more concerned about is not eating, or some people, it's a bit like modern day. We all know we shouldn't eat donuts, but we eat donuts because they're not good for us, but we like them. But so the same would have applied in Shakespeare's day. But if you were someone who was particularly concerned about your health, you would eat the foods that benefited your complexion, as they called it, your temperament. Now, in Kate's case, in Taming of the Shrew, she is deemed by her husband, Petruchio, to be hot-tempered, So she has to avoid hot and dry foods. And there's this scene where Grumio, his servant, offers her lots of things like beef and mustard and tripe and neat's foot. And every time he offers her something, because she's really hungry at this point in the play, he says, no, you can't have that because it's going to make you even more choleric or more angry. So the short answer is no, I don't have any foods that are going to stop you from being angry or affecting your moods in, I hope they make you feel happy and sated. So if you're feeling down, they might be comforting in that respect. If we think about our modern interpretation, because what I've done is taken old recipes and done modern interpretations. So there are things like rice pudding, which I think's really, it's called a white pot in shit from that period, which I think is quite a comforting dish. And there's lots of sort of stewed and braised dishes, which are particularly nice this time of year.
Sam writes that, quote, the recipes in her book are organized to reflect the early modern meal structure. Now, Sam, tell us what the typical meal structure might have been. I mean, would Shakespeare have eaten what we think of as 3 meals a day, or would he have followed some other format?
Yeah, this is very different, actually, how we ate in the past to how we eat now. So we have to think of lunch being a relatively new thing. When I say new, it has been around for a couple of centuries, but in my world, that's quite new. So they didn't really have lunch in terms of it being a concept like sandwiches or, something quite a light bite in the middle of the day. They would have broken their fast. So when they woke up, they would have had at some point a breakfast per se, not cereal, obviously, but they may have had a sort of a wheat-based porridge or an oat-based porridgey type thing. Or they might have had toast and eggs and that sort of thing. There was I can't remember, Gervais Markham's got a recipe for bacon and eggs, although I don't think that's necessarily associated directly with breakfast. But the idea of breaking the fast was definitely existed. What is a bit confusing is that dinner tended to be between 12 and 2, for example. So we would think of that as lunch, but that was the main meal of the day. So they ate their big meal in the middle of the day, generally. This is the people that could afford to do that. I'm not sure the poorer people were so concerned about, they just ate when they could eat, whatever time it was convenient to eat to fit around their work. But the leisure classes, the wealthier people, would have eaten their big meal in the middle of the day. So you have in a scene in As You Like It, where Orlando says to Rosalind that he's going to meet the Duke and he'll be back by 2. So he's meeting him for dinner. He specifically says, I'm meeting him for dinner and I will see you again at 2:00. So that sort of gives you an idea of when they were eating their main meal of the day.
I can't imagine having dinner that early in the day. I have to ask, I would get hungry. I would get hungry before the next breaking of the fast. Surely they didn't just not eat anything from 2 until the next morning.
Well, they did have supper as well. So it's just different terminologies. It's just that the main meal would have been eaten in the middle of the day, and they would have, it depends, when you see the lists of foods that were served.
I'm going to look into this. I'm going to look into this more, because here in the South, we call lunch dinner, and then your dinner, meal, supper. Those are terms that are really common in this part of the US. And I just thought it was a Southern thing. But now I'm thinking that maybe we brought that over with us from England, perhaps. So I'm going to look into that more.
Very possibly, very possibly.
Sam's book outlines that meals were served in courses, but suggests that many courses would have been brought out simultaneously, as opposed to eating one course and finishing that before starting the next one. Sam, does that mean that the meal would have been served all at once, where the main meat of the meal was sitting right in the middle of the table, right alongside all the other sides? And how did the function of eating at a table work?
Yeah, so this is another thing that's changed a lot since Shakespeare's day. So when we talk about a course in Shakespeare's day, a single course would contain multiple dishes, and they were served at the same time. So I'm just going to read you a little bit from this book, which is The Good Housewife's Jewel by Thomas Dawson. And I have to say, this one, I'm only because I'm saving your listeners listening to me just ramble on like long lists. This is quite a concise list for one course. So the first course in this particular dinner consisted of a pottage or stewed broth, boiled meat or stewed meat, chickens and bacon, powdered beef, which is like a beef ham, for want of a better description, pies, goose, pig, roasted beef, roasted veal, and custard. And yes, that would have been a sweet-ish custard. Then there would be another course after that. So they would be served all this food, and then that would get cleared away, and yet another course would appear. And in this case, it was roasted lamb, roasted capons, roasted conies, which are rabbits, chickens, peahens, baked venison, and a tart. Doesn't say what sort of tart, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say it was probably a sweet one. And there could even be a third course after that as some really big meals. Now, the thing is that it sounds really good. It sounds like, great, you've got all this choice. Like it's a great big buffet that we would go to now, like an all you can eat. But the etiquette of the day dictated that you couldn't ask for, like if the beef was down the other end of the table, you couldn't ask the person at the other end of the table to pass you the beef. You ate what was put in front of you, and the choicest cuts and the nicest bits that were prepared got given to that the end of the table where the most important people were sitting, so the lord of the manor, or if you had royalty visiting. So it is quite likely that you may only have got custard, unless of course that was a favourite of the visiting dignitary.
It just sounds so interesting to me that it was so meat heavy. You had all of this meat followed by a small dessert, and then you would do it all again with so much meat. But it does make sense in that case why that heavy of a dinner wouldn't necessarily require another meal later in the day.
Yeah, but they did have vegetables, because there are vegetable recipes in the book, and they are genuine recipes that I've adapted. So I don't know why they're not always listed, whether they were just served and they thought they weren't important enough to mention.
They were sort of assumed, maybe, if you're serving certain kinds of meat, maybe there were certain vegetables that rather went
Who
with
knows?
it or something. Okay. Is your mouth watering for all the fun recipes we're discussing in today's show? If you'd like to try out some of these recipes and to see some of the primary documents from the 16th century, where you can look at recipes and check out ingredients and see even pictures of some of the ingredients, like capons, we have all of this packed into the extras for today's show, available for members of that Shakespeare Society. You can join us and get all the insider extras right now at CassidyCash.com/episode 406 and click on the members button. And now, back to the show. In the book, Sam describes milk, butter, and cheese as, quote, white meats, and mentions that they were as expensive as they were delightful. Sam, I've never heard of milk and butter and cheese called white meats. And so I'm wondering what happened in the late 1580s. Why were they known this way? And then what happened to make them suddenly so expensive?
So white meats, really, it goes back to these pre-Reformation days where meat was off the agenda on certain days of the week because we were fasting effectively. I know in Lent we tend to give up dairy products, but white meats refer to dairy produce. So your meat, your butter, your milk, your cheese, your cream. So that's where it stems from. Now, butter became quite popular by Shakespeare's day, and it was I'm not going to say everyone was eating it, because it was one of those things that was skimmed off. They would skim the fat off of the milk so that they could make lovely, luscious butter. And it was becoming more popular in sort of wealthy households. You only have to look at the recipe books to see that, because it is used quite extensively. Now, in the 1580s, William Harrison notes that butter was becoming excessively expensive because butter dealers were outbidding each other with the dairies. So they were paying more for the raw materials, if you like, for the butter or the cream to be turned into butter. And therefore, it was making the butter more expensive, because obviously they're passing that cost on to the end consumer. So it was certainly by that time, in that particular period, the 1580s, it was sort of the product wasn't frowned upon, but the practice of the butter dealers was being frowned upon by William Harrison, and I'm sure others at the time.
I would have expected everyone to have their own cow and be doing this for themselves. So I'm surprised but I guess that makes sense. The elite household, maybe they wouldn't have, but
I guess it depended, if you were someone like Lady Eleanor Fetterplace, who's got a famous book from this period that people like myself often refer to, she probably would have had a small farm or a small holding, as we would call it now, where she would have had her own cows and stuff. to produce her own butter. But if you were, say, a merchant class and you lived in a city, for example, you probably wouldn't have had your own cow. So you would have got butter from a butter merchant. But of course, if they, as I say, the price was going up, you suddenly, if it was a luxury and then suddenly it became a more expensive luxury, it was slightly disappointing if you couldn't afford it or justify the expenditure on it.
Several of Sam's recipes include modern ingredients like white flour, which of course the cooks of Shakespeare's lifetime would not have had. Sam, tell us about how you made your ingredient decisions for which ones to modernize and what to leave the same when it came to adapting the foods of Shakespeare's plays into items we can make today.
So with early modern recipes, and by the time we get to Shakespeare's day, there's quite a few cookbooks out there that we can refer to. So with these recipes, I try to be as faithful as possible. So I have a general rule that if it didn't exist or it wasn't widely used in Shakespeare's day or the early modern period, I wouldn't use it in my book. So you won't find any recipes containing chocolate, tomatoes. I have one recipe that contains potatoes, but this is a good example of where you have to make a judgment call, because they did use things that aren't parts of animals, for example, that we really would struggle to get hold of, things like pallets and even certain offal in this country, even in Britain. People aren't either keen on using it or it's quite difficult to get hold of unless you happen to have a very friendly butcher that can source it for you. But when it comes to things like this, like say potatoes, there is a famous recipe again from Thomas Dawson, book I was reading from a little while ago, called Tart Give Courage to a Man or a Woman. And it's basically an aphrodisiac tart because it contains sweet potato, but it also contains quince, which in themselves are quite hard to get hold of. But, they're not impossible. So I have used quinces, for example, quite often in the books. They were incredibly popular at this time. But this tart also contains cock sparrow brains and eringo roots. Now, again, eringo roots that you probably could get a hold of, or if you knew a good, nice, friendly forager, but I haven't included those. And as for cock sparrow brains, I think it goes without saying that I did not suggest that my readers go out and kill some poor little sparrows or any other little birds. Oh. I'm not condoning that in the least. And I can't say whether this my pie is very nice. I'm not sure it's going to make you feel any more lustful than normal, but there's no dodgy ingredients in it. So I say my general rule is if it didn't exist, don't use it. Or if it's
very accessible. It's things that you can get a hold of and get to experience this part of history without too much trouble.
Yeah, but the important thing for me is that people get to try the flavors of the past. So I do encourage people to use spices or sauce spices, like things like long pepper, which is you're not going to pick up in a supermarket, but you can get really easily online. I just, I want them to make the recipes. I also, they're modern recipes. I don't suggest they beat egg whites for 8 hours with a bunch of twigs.
Oh, I appreciate that merciful choice. Yes.
Or, go and find a sugar cone and then carve the sugar off. We can buy sugar in packs and that's great. And no, it isn't exactly the same. But as I say in the introduction to the book, you could, if you wanted to play a devil's advocate, you could argue that it's virtually impossible to recreate recipes of the past faithfully because ingredients have changed so much since, unless we got into a time machine. We're never.
Yes, there's always that element of you had to be there, that exact moment. But I want to make sure that I didn't speak incorrectly. I was under the impression that white flour wouldn't have been available for Shakespeare's lifetime because I expected that they wouldn't be bleaching it. But did I get that wrong? Would they have had white flour?
Well, it wouldn't have been bleached for sure. That's one thing. They did have a kind of white flour. It probably isn't by out today's standards as white as we would expect today, and it would have had a bit more brown in it, but they certainly had a type of white flour that they would have used for things like manchette bread, which was the highest quality bread, and they would have used it. A lot of recipes at this time, unless you're making a paste, for example, and even like pastry, even that, it depends what was, at this point they are starting to eat the paste. So that a white flour would have been preferable. But even, like a venison pasty that I mentioned earlier when we were talking about Hamlet, that they quite often used a rye paste for, because it was a means of actually preserving what was inside. So you would cook your massive piece of, joint of venison in a rye paste and then seal it and then send it off to a relative at the other end of the country. And supposedly they lasted for months. I mean, and that's something else I wouldn't try without modern refrigeration.
That, but that's amazing. So, but these were flours that were essentially ground wheat into powder. So we're talking about the same kind of flour as what we have today.
I mean, essentially, yeah. I mean, it would have been more, it wouldn't have been quite as refined, but they did have a purer type. And as you can imagine, because of the labour that went in to get rid of the bran, that was more expensive. So it wasn't as accessible to everyone.
From your work into this topic, if we're new to this branch of food history and we want to explore it further, obviously start with Much Ado About Cooking and check out some ways to cook from. I'm excited about the opportunity to cook some books from Shakespeare's lifetime, but what are some additional resources? You've mentioned several just in our conversation. I know you must have a treasure trove of knowledge about what books to check out. Can you recommend a couple for us to use to learn more?
You can get an awful lot of the books that I've mentioned so far online, absolutely free. Sometimes they've been literally scanned and digitized. Other times they've been sort of typed up, for want of a better description, but they appear not in oldie worldy text, so a bit easier to access in terms of reading them. Although the words are just as they would have been back then. So there was A Good Housewife's Jewel by Thomas Dawson. The English Housewife by Gervase Markham is really good. There's A Good Housewife's Handmaid for the Kitchen, which sometimes is attributed to Dawson. There's a plethora. I'll say plethora, that makes it sound like there's like nowadays, but there are lots of books. Another author to look out for is John Partridge and John Murrell. And I always get their books mixed up, so I have to forgive me, but I've given you the name, so
yes, we'll find them.
But if you want a modern book that goes more in depth, because this book, although there's lots of research that's gone into Much Ado About Cooking, it is a recipe book at the end of the day, and it's great if you want to give that sort of an entry into cooking historical food. It's perfect for that. I know I would say that because I'm the author, but if you want to learn more about food from this period, I can recommend Cooking and Dining in Tudor and Stuart England by Peter Breers, which is published by Prospect Books, and also Eating with the Tudors by Brigitte Webster, which is published by Pen and Sword. And I think a paperback version of that's come out. I'm pretty sure there's a Kindle, ebook of it as well. So they're really two really good books if you want a bit more detail on sort of culinary practices of the day.
Absolutely. We will place links to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode, so make sure you stay tuned for the URL for where to find those on our episode page this week. And if you'd like a podcast companion to these recommendations, Brigitte Webster has been a guest on our show a couple of times, but she did join us specifically to talk about eating with the Tudors, so I'll link you to that in the show notes as well. Now, Sam, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, you know what? I've just mentioned this. I would take Gervase Markham's The English Housewife, because there are recipes in there, and they're not just food recipes. There's recipes for medicines, which could come in handy, but he's also got hints on brewing and bread making and dairying. So providing I could find some grains of some description and a cow or a goat or maybe a sheep, that a female one at that, I think I'd be pretty much set up to fend for myself and be self-sufficient. So that's the book I would take.
So in addition to wonderful foods, it can also be your survival guide. I appreciate this perspective for sure. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm still putting the finishing touches to my podcast. It's never ending, as you know, with podcasts. So I'm working on season 4 of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, which has water as its theme. And I'm also working on the A is for Apple podcast, where we're exploring the culinary items beginning with the letter C. So, yeah, that's what I'm currently focusing on. No books on the horizon at the moment, but I've got lots of ideas and I'm going to be hopefully researching them during the coming year.
How exciting. So much fun. Thank you so much, Sam Bilton, for being with us this week to help us understand recipes from Shakespeare's lifetime and mentioned in his plays. We really appreciate you being here to give us this opportunity and to help us learn more. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
To see more history related to the recipes of Shakespeare's plays, as well as to find clickable links to the resources Sam mentions for you today and those extra podcast episodes related to food history from Shakespeare's lifetime, be sure to check out our episode page today at CassidyCash.com/episode 406. That's CassidyCash.com/EP406. While you're there, be sure to check out That Shakespeare Society and consider joining us as a member, where we take a deep dive into food history and even try out some of these recipes together that you can cook at home. There's all kinds of primary documents, museum artifacts, and more to find in there. So make sure you check the links for That Shakespeare Society. And again, the URL for all these things is CassidyCash.com/episode 406. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.